The disgraced former president Donald Trump pleaded not guilty to federal charges on Thursday over his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, marking the third time this year that the former president has been forced to respond to a criminal indictment. Trump was arrested and arraigned on 4 felony counts outlined in Special Counsel Jack Smith's indictment: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of and attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. The arraignment came 2 days after Smith's office filed its indictment, accusing Trump of executing a criminal scheme to remain in office even after it became clear that he'd fairly lost the 2020 presidential election to Joe Biden. Earlier today, Trump traveled from his Bedminster club in New Jersey to Washington with his lawyers and several top aides to appear at the arraignment. He was formally arrested at the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse, just blocks from the U.S. Capitol, where the deadly January 6 insurrection unfolded. And the coverage of Trump's arrival, him flying on his Boeing 757 in Trump colors, arriving at the airport, the landing of the aircraft was covered by the mainstream media. This heat on this guy was incredible. And my concern is that, criminals shouldn't get this type of attention. Despite the fact that he's a former president, he has pretty much proven that he is not a patriot. He's not somebody that cares about the country, he only cares about himself. His brand, the Trump emblem on the side of the aircraft, just confirms the ego, the inflation of this man's head.
This is a very sad day for America, and it was also very sad driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing the filth and the decay and all of the broken buildings and walls and the graffiti. This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it.
I would agree. It is a sad day for the United States. It's a sad day that you decided to try and cheat in the election, to try and overturn the results, and to convince your fan base that there was fraud when there was not, and then to grift money from them so that you could pay your legal bills.
This is not the place that I left. It's a very sad thing to see it.
And for you to describe Washington, D.C. as decaying and trying to blame Biden for the state of the city is clearly a lie, because the route you took on Interstate 395 is basically walled and tunneled and underground. If anything, you saw 3 blocks before you got to the courthouse. And, find me a metropolis that doesn't have graffiti. That's not the point. The point is not what it looks like, but what it feels like. And trust me, the people in D.C. are thrilled that you are not the president anymore. They are thrilled that they don't have to put up with the National Guard on the street and people fighting for their rights because you are an autocratic and dictatorial president.
And it was also very sad driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing the filth and the decay.
It's surprising to me, and probably surprising to everybody else, that the first thing you want to talk about after you've been arrested is the fact that the city is not looking as pristine as you would have liked. I mean, that is just plain weird. But, we've come to expect this from you, somebody who thinks completely different to everybody else in a very insular and self-absorbed way. And it would have been so much nicer if you'd have just accepted the fact that you lost all your 60 court cases trying to find out if there was election fraud. You've been told by multiple senior officials, both whilst you were president and since, that the election was not stolen. The nicest thing to do for the sake of the country, if you were a true patriot, is to say, yes, I screwed up. I'm sorry, and I should pay the price, and I'll go quietly. But you won't.
When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America. This is the persecution of the person that's leading by very, very substantial numbers in the Republican primary and leading Biden by a lot. So if you can't beat him, you persecute him or you prosecute him.
It's not the persecution of a political opponent, it's the persecution of the guy who staged a coup against his own country. You kind of leave out kind of months and months of American political history. Just remember what happened. You refused the peaceful transfer of power. That is the bit that this is dealing with. When you said, no, I'm not leaving the White House, you gave many press conferences where you said, yes, there'll be a peaceful transfer of power to another Trump presidency. You had no intention of leaving. Now, think about that, because if you want to compare the US to, say, Russia, where Alexei Navalny, a political opponent of Putin, is currently in prison, if you want to compare it to that, then you have to kind of ask yourself very seriously whose side you are on. Because Alexei Navalny did not try a coup against Putin. All he did was offer up an alternative party for people to vote for in a democratic forum. Not good enough for Putin. And here we are, looking at you, a sad, lonely, pathetic man who has just been arrested for the third time. And let's be clear, you committed a fraud upon your supporters, upon the voters of the United States, at such a high level that it is arguably the most serious crime committed in American legal history. That's how serious it is. So don't compare the US, which is still just about a free and fair democratic country, and this case that you are going to be up in front of a judge and jury for is really the linchpin to decide how we want to go forward. Do we want to go forward like Russia, or do we want to go forward like the free America that we all came here for?
This is the persecution of the person that's leading by very, very substantial numbers in the Republican primary and leading Biden by a lot.
And now you lie again, claiming that you are leading Biden by a lot. I mean, let's be clear. Joe Biden is the president, right? He is not a criminal. He hasn't committed any crimes. He's never been arrested. He's never been arraigned. He's never been up in front of a judge. He is just doing his job. Whether you like his policies or not, that is for voters to decide. But you can't make stuff up about your opponent when you are the one who's been arrested. When your crimes have been corroborated, majority by Republicans, people who worked in your office, people who worked for you. When the January 6th investigation happened, almost all of the witnesses that testified against you were your people. They were Republicans. People like Cassidy Hutchinson, who was the assistant to your chief of staff, who was right there. She watched it, she heard it, and she had enough of a conscience to report it. Unlike people like Bill Barr, for example, who is now traipsing around TV news studios trying to make himself look good when he could have blown the whistle on the Trump presidency at any point during those 4 years. And instead, he sneaked out the back door a couple of weeks before the coup. He knew it was coming, and he chose to say nothing. And isn't this the point, that there are so many witnesses to these crimes? And to claim this is political persecution, nobody is buying that. To claim that you are ahead in the polls, nobody is buying that. Joe Biden is definitely ahead. And trust me, once your legal case gets underway, and once this courtroom starts to hear the evidence that we have been reading in this 47-page indictment, your poll numbers will continue to go down and down and down. Now, let's be clear why there is such a concerning number of people that would still support Donald Trump despite him being charged with these crimes. And that is because of his repeated use of language, claiming that it's a witch hunt, even going back to what he calls Russia witch hunt, which was of course not the case. The Russia inquiry and Robert Mueller's, the special counsel, did find Trump liable. They just couldn't prosecute him because he was the president of the United States. If you took the time to read the Russia document, you'll see that Trump does not come off very well. And so he managed, through Bill Barr yet again, to convince people that he was innocent of colluding with Russia. He managed to do that through repetitive use of language and by, on every interview and every rally that he went to, pushing home the same message, meaning that people watching heard it so many times in multiple places, it gets repeated by his friends on Fox News, and then they start to absorb the information as truthful. And it's exactly the same with this indictment and his previous 2 arrests. He just repeats the language that this is a witch hunt, that this is political persecution. And as we know through study of Adolf Hitler's use of language, if you say it enough times, eventually people start to absorb this information and then they forget who provided it. They forget that Donald Trump is the one that implanted these things into their minds. It's brainwashing. It's mind control. It's undue influence. And so America is the worse off for it because the pillars of democracy, the FBI, Department of Justice, the executive branch, they all rely on us trusting the system. And when somebody as criminal as Donald Trump gets in the White House, he cares nothing for these institutions, and consequently he starts his plan to kind of bring them down. And that is why so many people in this Reuters Ipsos poll come out and say they would still support him, because he has devalued the Justice Department. He has devalued the work of Robert Mueller and the work of Special Prosecutor Jack Smith. And by doing that, if you say it enough times, eventually people start to think it's true. But it's not. It's all a lie. It's all propaganda. And Donald Trump will be eating his words when he gets up in front of the judge and the jury that, with this much evidence, are very likely to convict him of these crimes.
So if you can't beat him, you persecute him or you prosecute him. We can't let this happen in America. Thank you very much.
And if you don't want things like this to happen in the United States of America, then don't commit the crimes. I'm Anthony Davis. You can hear me every day on the 5-Minute News podcast, on Wednesdays on MAGA Uncovered, and on Sundays hosting The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.